I'm going to talk about the career of William Tite, the architect, and some aspects of his career which have been investigating since lockdown. He was well known to me, and I was interested in the fact he operated a number of offices in France and northern Britain in the 1840s, perhaps uniquely for the time. I couldn't have done this without the help of John Minnis, Philip Brown and Jonathan Clark, all architectural historians, and Peter Kay, a historian of London's minor railway stations. And so in a sense, this isn't just Mike Chrimes talking, it's Mike Chrimes having gained the information from a number of other people, and I'm very grateful for that. The research itself raised a number of questions about which stations in general that have been attributed to him were actually his work, how typical his career, a blend of architecture, surveying and finance was for the time. So at the end, I'll leave some questions for you. So I'm going to cover Tite's significance, his family background, his training, his early works, his railway architecture, warehouses, commercial and office buildings, his views on architecture and engineering, some conclusions, and then invite some comments. In terms of his significance, he was by far the wealthiest British architect of the 19th century. He was president on several occasions of the leading architectural bodies. He designed the Royal Exchange in the City of London, one of the most prestigious buildings of the time. He was architect for a number of railway stations, both in the UK and in France. He was an active member of many bodies, had a great deal of political influence as an MP, and used his many memberships and positions to influence debates on architectural style and education and the relationship between the works of the architect and the engineer. His family background was as the son of a wealthy London merchant active in the Russian trade, and he grew up on the shop in the City of London, initially near Bart's Hospital and then Fenchurch Street. The family business owned premises around Leadenhall Street, and Tite's sister married William Green, his father's partner, and his nephew Arthur Green became his pupil and partner. He had a lot of other important family connections, such as the Burnell family of builders, while his wife Emily was the daughter of a successful stationer, and is alleged to have said to the Prince of Wales, "I've inherited a fortune, married a fortune, and made a fortune." His wealth is really beyond comparison in terms of architects of the time. This slide may be difficult to read, but Tite himself left an estate of around £400,000, which is comparable to estates of the leading railway engineers of the time, people like Robert Stevenson and Joseph Locke. But it's something like 3 times that of the wealthiest architects, people like Scott and Soane, and more than twice that of Waterhouse from the late 19th century. So it's a remarkable amount of money and is an indication of his broader influence. Like most of the people, business people of the time in the City of London, he lived above the shop, and this is a Tallis view of Fenchurch Street, where he lived in the early decades of the 19th century. And there's only one building really that gives much indication of what the street might have been like at that time, which is the East India Arms pub, which is a remarkable survival in that context. He attended schools around the City of London, in the Tower and in Hackney, and then possibly attended the Philippinum Gymnasium in Marburg in Germany, before beginning in 1814 a 6-year apprenticeship as a pupil of David Lang, one of the leading architects of the time. Lang was fully occupied with work for the Board of Customs and especially the ill-fated London Custom House. Around 1807 to 18, Tite attended Soane's lectures at the Royal Academy and began to submit drawings to their exhibitions, mostly churches, but latterly including designs for a bridge in St James's Park and a replacement for London Bridge. He was able to afford a continental tour, travelling to Italy, and his career got off to a flying start, based initially in Jewry Street in the City of London. His training reflects an increasing professional approach to architecture, with the emphasis on pupillage rather than through practicing one of the building trades. The absence of a professional body for architects led Tite to join the ICE. Among his supporters was the ironmaster George Cotton, and Tite must have known all the leading engineers and builders in the city as well as his fellow architects. From the start, his business must have involved surveying and property valuation, though there was little record of this before the 1830s, when he was carrying out work for the Irish Plantations Society in Northern Ireland. His first job for which he's been credited is for Lang, while still his pupil, on St Dunstan in the East, in the Gothic style, and from the start he revealed himself as a master of both classical and Gothic architecture. The first building for which he was known to have been fully responsible is the Scotch Church in Regent Square, 1824 to 1827, and this was the beginning of a long-term association with nonconformist architecture. He designed a chapel in Fish Street in the city and a church in Dollar in Scotland as well. And it's possible that his clerk on the Scotch church was Charles Porden, who lived nearby and with whom he was certainly later associated. Perhaps more interesting is the classical style of Mill Hill School, work beginning slightly later, and this had a remarkably long frontage, but of greatest interest really is the interior first floor, where I used a fireproof floor about 300 feet long, 15 feet wide, comprising Yorkshire flags, 4.5 foot centres on inverted wrought iron T-trusts on the Farrell system, with Roman cement to pack the joints. His early business contacts included the leading coaching carriers, Horn and Chaplin, for whom he rebuilt the Golden Cross Hotel at Charing Cross in the early 1830s. They became leading railway carriers, and later the two next one in Gresham Street was another building he refurbished for them and redeveloped, and he was involved in other business schemes with them. Another contact of the mid-1830s was the newly formed joint stock bank, the National Westminster Bank, and its main office at Lothbury in the city. The banking hall there apparently set the design standard for such halls for the next 50 years or so. So it was a very influential building internally, although the exterior was designed by Cockerell. He remained connected with the bank, and his last partner, Clifton, designed the surviving bank building in Broad Street in the City of London. He and leading bank directors began to get involved at this time in railway finance. Tite's office from around 1831 was in St Helens Place off the City of London, and it bears a remarkable resemblance to Great George Street, where the civil engineering offices of that time were located. In his case, there was a counting house, a merchant's office on the ground floor, and he occupied the first, second and third floors, presumably with a drawing office, an office for himself, probably some kind of business manager, and the space for his clerks and pupils. But interestingly, he didn't live on site, part of an increasing trend for people to move away from their city offices from the 1830s, and he had a home initially in Bloomsbury and then later in Lowndes Square alongside his business associates in the railway world, Joseph Locke and Thomas Brassey. His chief assistants through his career were Ebenezer Trotman, well known at the time, 1830s, advocate of Gothic the Gothic style in architecture, and this is a drawing for one of his villas reproduced in Loudon's cottage architecture. His nephew Arthur Green was his pupil and associate for many years, from the 1830s to 50s, and as already mentioned, Charles Ferdinand Porton was a clerk on many of his jobs. Trotman was almost certainly responsible for the design of some of the buildings at the South Metropolitan Cemetery in Norwood, and this was the first cemetery to be designed in the Gothic style in London in the 1830s. But of course, Tite's much better known, really, as a railway architect. And in that regard, his original work and involvement seems to have been on the financial side. He was a director of the Great Western Railway, a director and then surveyor of the Eastern Counties Railway, a surveyor and architect for the London and Blackhall Railway for many years, and architect and surveyor on the London and South Western. This variety of roles clearly suited him, but is indicative of his broader career pattern, and it makes it very difficult to pin him down. As a surveyor for London property values, even at 1% of his fees on the value of a property would have been a considerable amount of income at that time, and probably more important than any money he could have earned for the design of individual buildings. Through the 1840s, his range of clients grew, all really coming through contacts he'd made on the London and Southampton Railway through his banking contacts, and then with Joseph Locke as the engineer, and with Thomas Brassey as contractor. So this saw him in France on the Paris-Rouen Railway in the early 1840s, the Rouen-Le Havre Railway, probably the Dieppe Railway, and then with Locke's railways in the north of England, Lime Street Station, the Lancaster-Carlisle Railway, and then up into Scotland on the Caledonian Railway, while carrying on with work for the London and South Western, finishing probably around 1861 on the Yeovil and Exeter Railway. This would have involved him really with knowledge not just of the railway world, but the London property market, and it made him a key witness, and his abilities as a speaker, and he was in heavy demand through the railway mania years as a surveyor and parliamentary witness, generally in lines associated with Locke and Errington. So we had the question about who designed the stations on these lines. Where was the design work carried out up for the office in France and Scotland? Did Tite suggest the other architects and surveyors known to have been involved in these works? Who actually designed the railway train sheds? What's known about the main station structures? And were Tite's arrangements normal? Was it normal for somebody to be involved at so many levels as an architect, surveyor and financier? His work for the London and Blackhall Railway is in many ways the most interesting. Here he designed all the stations. Drawings of his work, as seen here, were widely published. There are stylistic similarities with many of his other 1840s railway buildings. Nothing exceptional in terms of the architecture, but it becomes a more interesting story over time. Robert Stevenson said in Parliamentary Evidence that Tite had had nothing to do with the use of iron in the early structures, but this must surely refer to the sheds rather than the internal design of the station buildings with their trusses and in some cases overall station roofs. It's certainly clear that he was responsible because the engineer got him involved, at that time George Berkeley, with the Fenchurch Street station as it survives today when it was rebuilt in the 1840s and 50s. And he also played a significant role in the design of all the warehouses around the minories serving railway companies from all over Britain to give them access to the City of London. So an important portfolio of work associated with this. Unsurprisingly, the London terminus of the Southampton South Western line was also widely illustrated, and Tite himself made clear that the early buildings on the site were designed by the engineering staff, but the terminus definitely his building. The colonnade frontage became a characteristic of his railway station designs in the 1840s, while Southampton stations remains a rare Tite survival from the time, a rare terminus station to have survived from the 1830s. And again, it could be described as a classical or Italian design, which he generally favoured. For intermediate stations such as Surbiton, Kingston and Winchester, it's not certain who made the design. Ditton Marsh at Esher, something of a cottage building, was done by the engineers, but where more imposing buildings were required, Tite was almost certainly employed, and these three stations shown here have generally been credited to him. At Gosport, which was for a time the terminus for Portsmouth, he was definitely heavily involved in negotiations with the military, who were concerned about the implications of a station so close to the dockyard facilities. He had to lower the height of the building. And again, although the engineering of the structures isn't that interesting, he'd obviously designed the overall roof over the platforms, and it's been magnificently restored recently, the station. Of the later stations, Windsor with its royal connection, Eastleigh part of the Gosport line and Salisbury are all generally attributed to Tite, and Windsor shows a variation in design approach which was seen in other later station buildings. Joseph Locke reported on the Paris-Le Havre railway route to English investors associated with the South Western Railway in 1839. Negotiations for the concession were protracted. It was not until 1841 that Mackenzie and Brassey Contracting Consortium began work. Initially on the Paris-Rouen line, it's uncertain when Tite was first consulted, but certainly by the late 1842. It's been suggested that French engineers may have designed some intermediate stations. The similarity to Tite's work elsewhere makes it likely he provided the prototype, with Locke's engineering staff designing workshops associated with the railway. The two termini in Rouen, the other was for the line from Rouen to Le Havre, echo Tite's other early terminus stations already seen in some of the slide views, but he's also credited here with the design of the passenger train sheds. On the French lines as a whole, a variety of designs were used, including Flemish and Tudor, consistent with Tite's work in Britain. So how was it all organised? Tite had the Royal Exchange job on the go in the early years, but other railway work had dried up, so he, like Locke, Mackenzie and Brassey, would have been able to visit France regularly. It would have been a 2-day trip to get beyond Rouen, so he'd have needed people he could trust on the ground. The two architects or builders on the Paris-Rouen line, John Hay from Scotland and his wife's relative George Burnell, with engineering training from a well-established family of London builders. It's possible they'd had their own office, but more likely they shared premises with the engineering staff. Tite is known to have been active and was in the drawing office for the Rouen-Le Havre line at the time the Barentin Viaduct failed, and he provided a replacement design. So the Tudor approach was seen on the lines going north from Lancaster as well. And as the French work wound down, the Locke Brassey team moved over there. And here the buildings have this distinctive Tudor Gothic feel. The Carlisle office was run by Arthur Green, assisted for a time by Thomas Worthington, who made a name for himself as a Manchester architect later. And at Carlisle, it's probable the train shed was designed by the engineering staff. So in France, it's likely he used a relative. And again, at Carlisle, it's likely he was using a relative to run subsidiary drawing offices. This Tudor style continued north of the border, and Perth was closely modelled on Carlisle, with Gothicist Trotman showing the Caledonian Railway directors Tite's design for Carlisle, which was in effect adopted at Perth. More Italian designs were intended for Glasgow and Edinburgh, but work never got past the foundations. The money ran out. Trotman remained until Perth was completed, but the Carlisle office was shut. The ill health of Tite and Trotman killed off what work was left, moving north into Scotland. The near contemporary station at Liverpool Lime Street ended up a bit like a gross version of Southampton or Rouen, but the London and North Western Railway directors were not happy to give Tite the train shed design, unlike the situation in France, and it was famously designed by Richard Turner. The building itself survived into the 1980s when it was demolished for a car park. In southern England, the London and South Western Railway extension to Waterloo and potentially on into the city involved Tite in endless parliamentary evidence, the design of a new station at Vauxhall and the terminus station Waterloo Bridge. Again, shortage of money played a part, and Waterloo Bridge was never a satisfactory station. Porden was the clerk of works here, and other surveyors and architects were involved on the London and South Western Railway work at this time, presumably because Tite had to concentrate on what was going on in France and northern Britain, which were far more distant. It's interesting to see what Tite said of his works at this time, really. At Carlisle and Perth, and more recently on the Exeter line, I've done my best to mould the forms and thinking of medieval architects to the unusual requirements of railways. At Rouen, in the two stations at Le Havre and at Southampton, Gosport, Blackhall and other places, I adhered to the more usual styles and perhaps with better success. So he seems to have felt that his Italianate or classical approach was better suited than the Tudor Gothic, which had its admirers. One area with which he was familiar was that of warehouses, a former building he'd have known from his childhood and which dominated the streets around the eastern margins of the City of London. He admired the design of early Victorian warehouses, but unfortunately with no record of his own practice beyond the massive railway warehouses developed around the Minories in the 1850s, which included the Great Northern Railway warehouse on the site of Minories Station, and the influence of the London and Blackhall original station can be seen quite clearly in this facade here. Unfortunately, all that remains today are a few masonry arches and remnants of wrought iron jack arch floors alongside the current Dockland Light Railway terminus at Tower Gateway. So we have to rely really on maps and older photographs to get an impression of the scale of these warehouse buildings, which he was known to being involved through the 1850s. Perhaps his most controversial appointment was as architect to the Royal Exchange, where his city connections and willingness to economise saw him emerge victorious through a series of competitions, although he was accused of stealing others' designs. The building was somewhat eclectic in its style, with classical portico and pastiche of other styles. It was notable for being promoted in the architectural press, as well as its construction being recorded by the Illustrated London News, seen here with the view of the scaffolding. And it was possibly the only building for which Tite had models built, including the one shown here being displayed to Queen Victoria, and also models were made for the client, the Gresham House Committee. It was also noteworthy for having a clause in the contract to protect antiquities, a subject on which Tite paid for a printed catalogue at a time when he was heavily involved with the railways of the railway mania years. Tite was also involved in the early development of purpose-built offices in the City of London. Such buildings began to appear. This is Mincing Lane, where Arthur Green, his associate, was designed an early building in the 1840s. So although large government office complexes had existed in the late 18th century, business offices, just like his father's, were generally over the shop. And it seems that really it's not till the 1820s that the first attempts at commercial office buildings come forward. and associated with the Royal Exchange was Janson's design for the Royal Exchange buildings, and soon after the work of Arthur Green in Mincing Lane. But if we're looking at Tite, then probably the only example that we can look at today is Tite's buildings in Huddersfield, part of a scheme to redevelop a new town, if you like, in Huddersfield, which was cut short by Tite's ill health. The largest early example was Gresham House development on the site of a former government excise office, and there went later developments in Gresham Street, such as Tafflin's carpet showrooms. These are all on a colossal scale. And the Gresham House development, which you can see the plan here, was a collaboration with a new partner, Clifton, who actually had offices in the existing excise building and a big business as a commercial surveyor, as well as an architect, and really an ideal partner for Tite in his later career. Their latest collaboration was East India House, which was on the site of a whole lot of warehouses and ancillary buildings formerly owned by the East India Company, with finance provided by Thomas Brassey and other railway associates. It was building on a colossal scale, akin to what's been going on around Bishopsgate, similar sort of area in the last 20 years in the City of London, although modest by modern standards. And his buildings were criticised because they didn't provide much internal light, but otherwise were presumably on normal fireproof standards of that time. Tite's views on architecture are perhaps the most interesting in many ways. He was obviously manifold in his use of styles. This is his last collaboration with Trotman on a Byzantine style, Gerard's Cross. And in his writings we can see discussion about the use of classical and Gothic styles. We can also see the development of professional training rather than craft-based training of the architect, and his concerns about the supplanting of the architect by the engineer, which is a topical interest even today. So on the classical and Gothic side, we hear him say, "I was an early cultivator of medieval architecture," and we've seen that with his early churches. "I esteem it very highly and think I understand it. It was not reasonable to abandon the better styles of architecture for many purposes, for what I consider the fashion of the day." And in this he's really talking about how Gothic's appearing everywhere, and he was very influential in the abandonment of Gilbert Scott's plans for government offices in the Gothic style in Whitehall, and forced him to have a more Italianate style. Tite was of opinion, however, that Gothic architecture was too fashionable in England. He sincerely regretted it, partly perhaps because of early teaching, and perhaps because his recent visit to Italy had revived his old impressions. Classical architecture appeared to be almost forgotten by English students, and this, I suppose, is a reference back to his attending the lectures of Soane in his early 20s. The amazing extent, astonishing height and interesting effects produced by the continuity of the vaulted roofing and other parts of these Gothic buildings create in every mind awe and respect to those whose piety, genius, talent raise such characteristic structures. So he was full of admiration for old Gothic buildings and wrote in praise on many occasions. But Gothic architecture, however happily adopted for religious purposes, is little calculated for the common habits of life, more suited for Montezuma's house of affliction than a modern habitation. So Tite thought Gothic had its place, but he was much happier with other styles, and this really drew him into conflict with many others leading architects of the time, and given him the reputation for being conservative with a small c. On the rise of professionalism in training, he was obviously influenced by his own experience in the early 19th century, and wrote In 1810, it was then the custom to devote 6 years of a young man's life in pupillage. At that time, there was a fallacy, which perhaps even exists at this day, that it was necessary to send a young man who desired to be an architect into the carpenter's shop, or as it was technically called, he went for 3 years to the bench. He could hardly conceive how 3 years could be more completely wasted. The idea of sending a lad from school into a workshop to be qualified at the end of the term only in a very imperfect way to put together a door or a sash did appear to him be a most extraordinary waste of time. Luckily, he escaped the ordeal. So he really felt that the architect should be trained on a higher plane than had been the tradition, certainly in the 18th century. And one of the routes through to professionalism he saw as examinations. He praised the German architectural exams that he'd seen instituted in Berlin, and he hoped the time would come when an architect would be honoured because they'd passed an examination before the Institute of British Architects. And in a sense, this was a debate going on in the civil engineering profession and doubtless in the surveying profession at the time. How did you move away from, if you like, a handicraft approach to a more professional, educated approach to training? He had some interesting views on what had happened with fees and arbitration. He said James Walker succeeded in establishing that enormous scale of charges now universally adopted by engineers, which leaves architects very far behind, and are very different indeed from those recorded and quoted by Mr. Smiles in his charming Lives of the Engineers. And he was thinking, I suspect, that although architects claimed they wanted 5% design fees, they were often reduced to 3%, 5% on certain elements of the design, even down as low as 1%. Perhaps that's why he was keen on the surveying fees as well, whereas civil engineers were busy charging by the hour to enormous amounts, tens of thousands of pounds on some of the railways. And I think his view about the position of the engineer as arbitrator was pretty much the same. Brunel's characterised for the way in which he dictated payments as sole arbiter to the contractor, whereas he felt the architect should dictate solely in the building and architecture. In other words, he should confine himself to making sure the building was designed as it should be, and not be the sole arbiter of if costs escalated. And he was quite happy with an independent arbitrator, if necessary, to sign off payments, whereas people like Brunel consider themselves the sole arbiter on engineering contracts. Now, we've got his views on engineering. Much of what I've said suggested he wasn't really involved with the design of the structures, apart from the internal structures of stations, but there are examples of the kind of work that he did. The roof trusses at Rouen Station were clearly credited to him. It's known he was a skillful draftsman, so it's not fair to say he didn't get his, if you like, his hands dirty with the design of these buildings. And his views on what had happened in terms of the roles of the engineer and architect, and engineering and architecture as they developed in his lifetime, are quite interesting, really. He thought formerly architects and engineers were not separated as at present. Milne and Alexander, both architects, constructed Blackfriars Bridge and the London docks. If the engineers had not got ahead of the architects in later times, it was the fault of architects themselves. And one would have to challenge the role of Alexander as he saw it in the design of the docks, which most people would attribute to John Rennie, but it is true Alexander was involved to an extent with the buildings and had input into the docks overall. He regretted exceedingly the severance which had taken place between architects and engineers. Almost within his own recollection, there had been no such division between them as now existed, and it was well known that all the great architects of Italy were engineers likewise. So he felt, I suppose, that the engineering, or at least some of it, belonged within the scope of the architect to his day. And he said more about this. When the building for the 1862 London exhibition was being discussed, he said, "The claims of British architects to cooperate in the design of a building which ought essentially to represent the state of the art amongst us at the present day have been ignored, and foreigners are likely to form their opinions as to the merits of English architects from the production of a military engineer." So he really felt that architects had been completely sidelined in prestige buildings of this type at that time. And he saw this as a development from the 18th century. It was the development of the canal system which first led to the separation of engineers and architects. And to some extent this may be explained, for the pursuits of the architect lead his studies rather towards the condition of statical rather than of dynamical forces, while the canal and dock engineer has to deal very frequently with the latter. But in the execution of roads, railways and such works, there are no conditions which ought to be beyond the sphere of an architect's knowledge. That's Tite in November 1861. Here's a bad architect in the truest sense of the word, who is incapable of becoming the best workman in any of the branches of what I may allow as statical construction. Hydraulic engineering may require a different set of mental training and a course of study of a different character to that required for building in the open air. But it's absurd to suppose the man who can build a church couldn't build a bridge or viaduct, or that he should be unable to conduct great earthworks or tunnels. So he very much felt that the architect, perhaps through their own faults and weaknesses, had let themselves be supplanted where they should not have been by the engineers of the early 19th century and the railway age. In a way, it's interesting that he didn't really accept the role of dynamic forces in railway structures, but there we are. Then on the station design side, if you remember that Robert Stevenson said he had nothing to do with ironwork on the London and Blackwall Railway, there was quite a clear different relationship with working with Locke and Errington. Where I was the architect, as they were the engineers, they confined themselves strictly to their department, Mr. Locke having at an early period laid down the rule that as regards building, an engineer's functions ceased with the platforms. But that still leaves us with a question. Was it Tite who did the designs for the French railway stations? Was it Burnell? Was it Hay? Was there somebody else doing the calculations? It's uncertain. All we know is that they were widely known in the railway press at the time. This is from Bree's Railway Practice. So if you wanted to see what Tite had been up to, or his office, it was fairly easy to find out at this time. And then on structural calculations, it was a foolish mistake to suppose architects didn't calculate the strength of materials. So he thought the calculations should be done by the architect. And he seemed au fait with developments in iron and fireproof construction. He participated in a discussion on one of the Burnell's papers on French iron floor systems in 1854, and obviously he'd have known about this from his own work in France. The question of cost was probably the reason why joists of this character, i.e. wrought iron, had not been more extensively used. He was referring to Britain. He felt bound to claim a perfect acquaintance with this matter in his own experience of some 28 years. So he's referring back there to his work on the Mill Hill School. There was in fact nothing new in the principle either as regards the iron or the concrete. So he used cast iron beams with jack arches at the Royal Exchange. We have a problem, as many of his commercial buildings have been demolished. One has to assume he just did pretty much the same as his contemporaries. Rouen-Rive-Droite station had a 3-span train shed with 2 side spans of wrought iron trusses on slender columns and a central 20-foot span laminated timber arch, which he used to even greater effect at Dieppe. So there's some structural interest in some of his work and use of materials in that regard. And then he also was, I think, probably quite conservative in some ways. He'd seen a church in course of construction in Paris in which there were cast iron columns and cast iron ribs filled in with plaster in such a manner as would not be tolerated for a moment in England. But he did know that iron was first used to any extent by architects, so he was concerned that the engineering profession were being, if you like, credited with all the expertise in what would now be considered structural engineering. He really saw it as the province of the architect as much as the civil engineer. And there's plenty of other evidence of his interest in the use of building materials and knowledge. He was credited with using concrete with broken bricks in the aggregate by his contemporaries. He thought that Yorkshire landings were preferable to a thin concrete floor. He felt fireproof floors were more suitable for buildings like offices and hospitals, but he felt a different approach was required if decorated ceilings were going to be used. And at one of his talks, he described the history of chemistry and use of rock asphalt. So he was familiar with what was a new material in some ways being introduced. He described the use of glass at a REBA meeting, and he was well aware of the effects of corrosive acids on building stones, presumably from observing it in situ in London over the years. And again, his talks reveal some knowledge of the importance of geology and underlying ground conditions, and also aware of the different approaches to foundation design. At the Royal Exchange, they use a bed of concrete 6 feet thick, generally over gravel, and he spoke with knowledge of excavated sites across the city of London and the ground that were being revealed there. So he obviously was familiar with visual site investigation across the city from an early age. And he reflected on how the architect's training had changed, and really for the better, I suppose. What was available to him in 1810, well, you could attend the Royal Academy schools and lectures. You were allowed into the Royal Academy library once a week. Although there were plenty of books, they were scarce and expensive, and there was very little available published on Gothic architecture. And also your ability to get a decent pupillage. There were probably only 5 top-notch architects who could provide that kind of quality training available to aspirant professionals in 1810, out of a total of perhaps 50 practising in London. And it's not until really after 1831, with the establishment of the Architectural Society, then the RIBA, that you get a professional forum where architecture could be discussed and issues of architectural education and examinations taken further forward. And he was, as already been revealed, a key figure in this. So what conclusions can we have? He was a businessman, he was an architect and a surveyor. Our appreciation of his works hampered by destruction of much of it. There's uncertainty over how typical his career can have been. He had a lot more money, obviously, than many, but what we know is his associates seem to have had a semi-independent existence. They had their own offices, so not necessarily partners, with the exception of Clifton. The separation of the home and office. He was a skillful draftsman, and many of his early designs are published, so he was good at self-promotion. And coming back to whether he was a businessman foremost, an architect or surveyor, I think one has to bear in mind that when he began his career, people like Robert Milne were happily practising as architects, surveyors and civil engineers. This was not really until probably the time of his death in the 1870s, when the Chartered Surveyors got going, that there was a clear, if you like, career path for the 3 professions associated with the built environment. So he can't have been atypical in that, but I think his access to money and business circles did mark him out at the time. So we're left with the question, who designed the stations? I'd love to know what people think about that. The people he employed on the minor railways with which he was associated, did he recommend them, or were they employed directly by the railway company or at the request of the engineers? It's not really clear, and it probably varied from line to line and how busy he himself was. So, remembering, you can go to the centre of the City of London and look at his masterpiece, the Royal Exchange. Questions and answers, please. You can send them to my email, m.chrimes@ntl.com. And if anyone would like a copy of the paper on which this is based, I'd be happy to email it to them. Thank you very much, and I hope this, in this time of COVID, this has been a piece of entertainment that you've enjoyed and got something out of. Thank you.